Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, Rabbi Ken Spiro.
Hi, Ellie. Always great to be here.
So today we're going to do a zoom out. We're going to kind of go a macro picture to something that we've talked about in different angles before, but never quite as the 30,000 foot view that we haven't done in the past. I want to just acknowledge, just in this timing, that we are in this time after they found those six bodies of the hostages. So we are really in a state of collective mourning as a Jewish people. That politically things are also still exploding in Israel in terms of the focus on the protests and the strikes and whether we should do a hostage deal and have a ceasefire or not do that. There's a lot of unclarity and unrest. But I think one of the reasons that this topic was chosen for this week is if we get mired sometimes in the minutia, in the protests, in the return of the hostages, we'll sometimes miss the bigger picture of what's happening, meaning like we won't see the forest for the trees. So does that sound accurate, in terms of why we want to go here today?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is kind of like the end of what's been a very long process we've had since October 7th, where
Right.
even us in our podcast, we had this whole thing we were going to be doing otherwise, and we've just been pretty much for almost a year now talking about this stuff. But this
Yeah.
is like a micro version of what the Jewish world is in. And it's not healthy in a lot of ways. It's and especially now that things are starting to unravel a little in Israel politically because it's being politicized. I think it's like you talk about getting the 30,000 foot view. It's like let's just like stick our head out above the water and take a deep breath here and recharge ourselves and get some clarity. So I think it's a really, really important thing to do precisely at this time, instead of digging deeper into the hole, so to speak, to pull back and get some more light on this.
Okay, great. So we want to talk a little bit about what is actually at stake here. What is the conflict? What's at stake? What are we dealing with? But let's start. I think, as you mentioned, let's start with Israel. Let's start with going there and then work our way out. So, where should we begin so that we can understand this question of what are we really dealing with?
Right. So I mean, you could there's many different ways, Ellie, of understanding the conflict. You can look at it as, a struggle between two peoples on the same piece of real estate without going into whose claims are more legitimate and Palestinian stuff. You could look at it as a struggle between, a Jewish state in the heart of an Arab world. Um, but that's the simple, that's like the outer layers. I kind of look at this as like an onion. As the outer layers of the onion, that's the outer superficial geopolitical realities, which are to a certain level real, but they're not what's really driving the conflict that's going on. A lot of what is being focused on now, American and European and Canadian support for Israel, Western support for Israel, because it's based on, that this is a Western ally. People look at very geopolitically, the threat of Iran going nuclear and radical terrorist organizations taking over the Middle East. Um, but the alliance and the connection that we should be focusing on is something that transcends the here and now of the geopolitical realities of 2024 or what's been happening in the world in the last couple of years. It's actually much more ideological than we imagine that it is. And I think when we get to pull back and look at what is really at stake, what the conflict is really focusing on, who's attacking who and why they're being attacked, then we get a much more holistically clear view of why the threat that is being posed against Israel is really transcends the geographic boundaries of the Middle East and the Jewish state, and is something that really has massive consequences for the whole world. And I'm not just talking about Iran having nuclear weapons. I'm talking about massive ideological uh, consequences, moral, ethical, ideological, political, economic consequences for the world. So what we're seeing playing out in Israel is a micro version on a much more deeper political ideological level of a conflict that is already engrossing the entire world, but
Right.
because as it's spreading throughout the world, still the focus abroad is still on Israel, but abroad. like the
Right.
protests that are going on university campuses and in front of the White House or in wherever you're traveling around the world, it seems to be, oh, it's just like it's kind of metastasized to the rest of the world from Israel. But the reality is no. The reality is that what is being attacked, the attack is directly taking place on those places that are very far away from Israel on an ideological level. And we're just getting lost in the sauce and thinking it only has to do with the Israel-Palestinian problem or what Israel's doing in Gaza and yada, yada, yada. And that's a smokescreen on every single level.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because, yeah, it's definitely become the hot topic to talk about, what's going on in Israel. Middle East is always on people's minds or radars in terms of, peace in the Middle East being one of the great crowns in any king's, great jewels in any king's crown. And at the same time, you know, major events in the world are going largely ignored. Massacres, injustices, things that are happening. And again, I think, you mentioned also, like, we're not just focusing, say, on radical Islam. There are other pieces to this puzzle, but I think if we keep watching Israel, we will miss the larger picture of what's happening. And if you miss the larger picture of what's happening, you're not going to understand, like, things are going to feel random rather than, no, actually, this is a part of everything. This is all connected.
Right, exactly. Because, when we talk about looking how Israel is treated, like the double standard is a really interesting example of this. The hyper focus, you just mentioned that there are major humanitarian disasters going on in the world. There's millions of people in South Sudan in danger of starving. And there's conflicts in the world that are far more destructive, like the Syrian civil
Right.
war, which didn't get anywhere near the level of attention that Israel is getting. So the question everyone always asks is like, why is the world so hyper focused on Israel? This is far from the greatest humanitarian disaster, is what's going on in Gaza, and it's far from the greatest loss of life in a military conflict in the world. But even in that, because it's not normal, but even in that, hidden within that is the point of exactly what I'm talking about. That on the deeper
Yeah.
level, on what's really at stake on ideological level, is something that is very much connected to the Jewish people in Israel, and not just the modern state of Israel. I'm talking about
Mm.
our historical mission in the world and what we have brought to the world. And that is really what's going on here. And that is what is driving the hyper focus on a deeper level, which, by the way, most people yelling and screaming from the river to the sea and, free Palestine, they're all missing this point. The saddest part of all of this is everyone is listening to the people screaming, and it's not the issue.
Right.
It's like a box is on fire, but there's a house on fire down the street, and we're just looking at the little box and
Right.
screaming at it.
Right.
That's what,
So
and but
unpack that for us. So, like, how do we get from there to there? How do we put all of this together?
yeah. So if you geopolitically look at who's driving the conflict against Israel, we realize it's Iran. Okay, they're the ones who are fueling it. Now, and if you look at what Iran says, this is very insightful. What they say, they're always saying two things. They call Israel the little Satan, and they call America the great Satan. And they're always screaming when they have their rallies, death to America and death to Israel. Now, why those two? You could say, well, obviously, number one, America is the world's greatest superpower. It's the great bulwark against totalitarianism from World War II until the present. And number two, in terms of aiding and supporting Israel, America, there's no question that America plays by far the biggest role in terms of the billions of dollars of foreign aid that they're giving. But that's the mistake. This is again where we generally get sidetracked and think that's what's really going on. But there's something much deeper going on, beginning with the fact that Israel is not only the one Jewish state in the Middle East, surrounded by 22 states of the Arab League. Israel is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. None of the states that surround Israel are truly democratic states. Some of them have flirted with democracy. They have elections of some sort or another, but they're not truly open states. So
So
and
I
and
want to just stop there because I do think that that's an important piece of the puzzle. I think people think of, say, Lebanon, for instance, which we just did an episode on last week. Like, oh, doesn't Lebanon have elections? Doesn't Egypt have elections? Like, those, if you think of each country individually and ask yourself, does this country have elections? Are they a democratic nation? What are we looking at?
So again, you get like Turkey has elections, but Erdogan is always in power because he's taken over. When you can have an election in a country, but when you either rig the elections or don't allow free press or do
Right.
coups on people you don't like who are being elected, or civil wars break out in your country because you don't know what's happening, which is the every single one of the countries. Egypt, Mohammed Morsi was running the country, it was the Muslim Brotherhood, and now Sisi took over the country, and there was a coup. Jordan has elections, but the king is the king, and he's all powerful. The king of Jordan is far more powerful than the king of England.
Right.
Lebanon did have a sort of precarious, as we talked about last week, sort of kind of functioning system, but is now totally fallen apart. So now it's a failed state. Syria doesn't have anything at all like that. Iraq, forget it. It's like it's a mess. So,
Right.
but to pull out, but to pull out a little, and Israel really is a stable democracy. People don't realize that Israel, is it's a Jewish state, but it's a democratic state. 20% of the country are Arabs. Are there social issues in Israel? Absolutely. But do Arabs have equal rights? Can they vote? Are there restrictions? There's no restrictions on them.
Right.
So it's truly a
And a
functioning
stable
democracy.
democracy has room for the protests of the type that we're seeing without the government starting to go out there and murder its own citizens. Meaning, like,
Exactly.
Israel is freely allowing for in like hundreds of thousands of people to come out and protest, and they're not, gassing them or, shooting them or, those kinds of things. I think it's, that in itself is telling the vibrancy of a democracy is also how much you can push back on your own government.
Exactly. But also, you think about it, the America is unique. There's a lot of democracies, the fastest form of growing form of government in the last several hundred years. And if you go back before the United States in 1776, there was already beginning limitations, parliamentary monarchies and things like that, where you actually had certain level of checks and balances against the monarch, but there was no true democratic country in the world. America was really founded as a democratic republic, to be accurate here, to use our terms 100% correctly.
Mm.
But if you think about why America is being so focused on, push the superpower thing aside, push its support of Israel aside, America, in terms of the Western paradigm in modern history, is the role model for the greatest political experiment in the history of the world, arguably. When we create basically a country that is founded as a democratic republic. It didn't evolve out of a monarchy. It was founded
Right.
largely, okay, indigenous population of North America aside. It's basically a country that's founded almost entirely of immigrants who migrate into a place from all different countries and all different cultures and all different languages and all different forms of government. And they establish the in terms of revolutions. If you look, by the way, at revolutions, there was a revolution in England in the 17th century where the king is overthrown and Oliver Cromwell, and but that didn't create a democracy. It created a fundamentalist Christian state for about 10 years until the monarchy returned, albeit with a few limitations. France had a revolution after America, 1789, but that revolution became the role model for the Marxist revolution. It was incredibly violent. It was anti-clerical. It was against the institutions of the country,
Right.
going after church and state and the monarchy. And it led to a reign of terror. And it became the mothership, the role model, the paradigm for the Marxist revolutions that will come after it throughout history. That will generally be incredibly revolutionary, violent, and tumultuous. Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Cambodia, Vietnam. America, okay, there was a war we had with England, but there was no reign of terror afterwards. When the war was over, America wasn't a simple process. If you appreciate the miracle that's America, you had these independent little states that managed to create this idea of a federal government. It's an incredible story, the American story, and it became the United States. Became not only the great superpower of modern history in the 20th century, post certainly late 20th century, mid 20th century, from post World War II, it's the American century from World War II on for sure. But it's really become the vision of democracy and freedom and progress is the United States, because no country, and you cannot argue this point, no country has had a more successful political experiment than the United States in its political evolution from its inception, with the exception of the Civil War, of course, which is the big blot on that one, which was not to go into the history of the Civil War, but no countries granted more opportunity to more people coming from more countries in the world as the melting pot of the United States, precisely because it was able to create a working model of, not perfect, not everyone had the right to vote initially. There was slavery in America. Women were disenfranchised until the beginning of the 20th century. It's not like people have this, has to be this zero sum game of perfection appearing immediately.
Yeah,
But
and
what
I
America,
think that's part of the challenge is like many things can be true at once, right? There were injustices, there's cruelty involved in the building of the country. There were people who were treated as less than human or had no rights. And at the same time, the system that was built was to try to create a society that was as um supportive as possible for people to create a life that they wanted to. So all of those things can be true at the same time. And I think that's also part of the narrative that's been lost these days,
right,
which is you're either evil completely and always, or you're good completely and always. And there's no idea that there can be multiple things happening at once. And I think America's a really good example of that. And it seems like maybe that speaks to one of the bigger picture ideas that you're pointing to.
exactly, 100%. Because what America also embodies is, you're talking about countries are evil, despite, just to comment on what you were just saying, America's far from a perfect country, but the fact that it's able to get where it creates such prosperity and the world's greatest economy without having an empire, by the way, is an unbelievable success story. And without coups and without, like, overthrowing the governments and things like that. Again, the one exception, the Civil War, but it's been there's been a lot of bumps on the road, but it really is a remarkable story. But then the question we have to ask ourselves, which is like peeling off a few layers of this onion, is why was America so successful? On one hand, you could credit it with all these Europeans pouring into a piece of real estate which was grossly underpopulated, underdeveloped, of course, at the expense of the indigenous population, which is a separate topic. It's part of the dark side of that tale, of course, but that's the history of humanity: is people colonizing and conquering and suppressing, and
Right.
um, but and of course, it was a land of tremendous wealth, and it didn't and it could and you could start on a clean slate. It didn't have to evolve. It's much easier when you start new than to, gutting a house and redoing it is a lot more work than leveling the house and rebuilding it from scratch.
Right.
And
Meaning America and Canada and North America in general are young. They're young countries in comparison to most of the rest of the world. So, you can see that just infrastructure wise when you visit a city in America and you visit a city in Europe or then the Middle East, like there's no comparison in terms of the history of the buildings and the infrastructure and the land. So they had the ability to start on the foot of democracy rather than the foot of empires or all of these other there was never a monarchy in Canada or the US.
right, not no monarchy, but no feudal aristocracy, no class system like in England, which was a huge thing. Class is a huge thing. Stay on your level. Not that America didn't have any levels of inequality, and you had the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who their founders, sort of with the political lead of the United States. But what is really, really interesting, this is where it really gets interesting, is the timing of when America comes into existence in a period of time in history, which is after what we call the Renaissance, it's in the age of enlightenment, really, and going right into the Industrial Revolution. And when you peel away a few more layers of the onion, you see what it's like. It's great. You have this clean slate there. There's nothing built in. There's nothing built up. There's nothing built in. There's no structures of that you have to get around and get past the natural blocks of class and stuff like that. So you can do a great political experiment on a clean foundation over there. And this is where the connection really begins to become clear, because the other thing about America that is unique is it is the most God-based country that's ever founded in human history, is the United States. It's literally right there on the money: "In God We Trust," which has been an act of Congress that passed in the 1950s against godless communism, that the foundations of the United States are based on a certain evolution of a political, spiritual ideology, which begins hundreds of years before America. But it's kind of like the perfect storm of what happens. It's such a great story that people just don't know, because people don't understand and don't value their history and don't appreciate how amazing it is. But if we understand the political evolution of the Western world, which is where democracy comes out of, if we rewind 2,000 years ago, Western culture is, it's Greek. A lot of it comes from Greece and from Rome, and the Roman Empire was the largest, entity that ruled the Mediterranean. What is Europe? Most of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, but certainly with even when the Roman Empire, which had a massive influence on so many things, ceases to exist, the Western Roman Empire in 476 of the Common Era, the influence will reverberate much longer. But then with the collapse of central authority that was the Roman Empire, Europe sort of degenerates into what's called the medieval period or the Dark Ages, which weren't quite as dark as people think, but there was definitely a big step backwards in terms of central authority and stability and road system and the food chain, and populations shrunk dramatically in places like Rome. A fraction of the people lived in Rome 1,000 years ago compared to who lived in Rome 2,000 years ago, because there was no infrastructure or stability to allow for a large city to exist. When things fall apart, people go back to subsistence level existence. But out of that period of time, what emerges as the big player is the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, which before there was a split between Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestantism, which comes later. There was only one church, and they literally they were the biggest player in that feudal system of Europe. Because with the collapse of the Roman Empire, what emerges is this feudal system of landowners who become bigger landowners, and some of them get these titles, and some of them become such big landowners and become monarchs. It's a whole complicated story we can't begin to touch on. But this creates a class system, very much so, where most of the people are peasants and disenfranchised with no rights, a few elite that own and control everything and have all the power. There's no voting rights, there's no democracy, there's no citizenship, but there's a veneer of spirituality that's Christianity laid over everything, where the church is a huge player in that system, not just in terms of the influence of the church, but in terms of the actual lands and power that they control. The popes could be kingmakers. And
Right.
but Europe emerges from that into you want to say something?
I think it's really interesting because I would say two pieces, and maybe we could figure out how these play in. Number one, I think we often think of the church as staying in its lane, but I think the more history I read and the more I see accounts of that time, the church was intensely political. It was intensely organizing who should rule and who should reign and who should deal with the money and who should be in charge of this, and which countries are going to be for Portugal is going to have control of Japan, and this, and like they were very much a political entity as much as they were a religious system. And I think the other piece to me, which is interesting, is we often think of the West as innately associated with the secular. And so I think it's interesting what you're starting to put together, which is maybe it's not as secular as we think.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first things first, you're 100% right, because the church, the feudal system is based on primarily the most valuable thing you own is land. And the church is endowed with massive properties, which gives them a lot of money and a lot of power. People should just read about like the Medici popes and the Borgias and at the height of the perversion, by the way, the decadence of the church is unbelievable. Go read Boccaccio's Decameron, one of the first works of Renaissance period fiction, and coming out of Italy. You see how corrupt, because of the money and the power, they were just as much in the system, but they had the power to excommunicate, the power to crown kings. And Europe will, as religious wars and conflicts will be huge in Europe, especially when the church when breakaway about 500 years ago, and Protestantism emerges, and Europe will divide along the lines of those countries that are backed by the Pope and those that are not. And so, yeah, but you're right about also religion playing a huge role. Not all these countries. Today we have, countries like France become a country very early in European history. A country like Germany doesn't unite as a united country until the late 19th century, along with Italy, by the way.
Oh,
So going back 1,000 years ago, the church owned more lands in France than the king of France owned. So these were big players in the system. But you're right,
right.
there was the veneer. The number one way that you may have looked at yourself as a Frenchman, but Europe collectively looked at it. Today, it's like the European Union. But Europe back then, it's Christendom. My primary identity is that I am a Christian. We
Oh,
have
so
different
that's
states,
interesting.
but
So meaning their primary identity wasn't national, meaning I'm a German, I'm a Frenchman, I'm English. Their primary identity was their religious identity.
Yeah. It's
Got it.
like used to be before you had nationalism is a more modern conception. You had empires, you had tribals, and you had tribal and clan things are a much more older way of people creating, alliances amongst themselves. We're part of a family, an extended family, a tribe, which becomes a series of tribes can come together, a series of clans can come together and make a tribe, whatever. That's how the Arab Islamic world works, by the way, which predates
Right.
Islam. It continues to work until that way today. Excuse me. But so this is the way. So there is this veneer of spirituality, but it's only a veneer of spirituality. When I say a veneer, yes, everyone is Christian and everyone's getting their sacraments, and the church has tremendous power to damn you to hell and to grant salvation and forgiveness and absolution, which was a big moneymaker for the church, by the way. You go on a crusade, give us a couple thousand, whatever, and you're forgiven, that kind of thing. But a lot of it was just lip service to the faith without, for instance, the rates of literacy in Europe are shockingly low.
Mm,
People estimate that 1 in 1,000 people could read on average in
right.
most places. And there was no printing press. And the Bible, which is the backbone of the Hebrew Bible, is the backbone of the Christian Bible. There was no, it was not translated to any foreign languages. It was the local vernaculars, as Latin breaks apart into all these Latin-based languages, Spanish and French and Portuguese and Italian, and then you have Germanic languages like English. And English is actually a mix of both, interestingly enough. The Bible stays in Latin, which is not a spoken language, it's a church language. And not only that, the church maintained absolute fanatical control over ideology. Heresy, diverging from that, is a death sentence in medieval Europe, and sometimes in very horrible ways. And the church
Meaning
maintained.
saying anything that is in opposition to church doctrine, speaking, reading, thinking about, communicating about any ideas that might challenge what the church says is how the world works and how God works and what people are supposed to do in their lives. That is considered heresy.
Right,
Is that right?
exactly. Exactly. It's diverging from what's established in the case of the Catholic Church. The Pope, who is the ultimate of all cardinals, because the cardinals elected him, he is Christ's vicar, as they call him. And what he says goes. He's infallible. So the church, in order to maintain orthodoxy within belief, which is one of their ways of maintaining control, because when they lose control of theology, you have the politicization of theology leads to breakaway states. Look what happened to King Henry VIII when he couldn't get in, when the church wouldn't annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. He just makes his own church and he breaks away despite the church's best efforts to rein him in. So look at
Right.
the political implications, which that's going to lead to massive conflict further down the road between, the daughter of, Anne Boleyn, who's the wife he marries, whose daughter is Queen Elizabeth I, the Church of England fighting Spain. It's unbelievable how this becomes very politicized and has huge implications for much more than just faith. But the church, in order to maintain orthodoxy and keep people in line, I mean, the average person in Europe is an illiterate peasant who has no time for anything but trying to avoid starving to death. And they
Right.
can't read or write. They don't know anything. So, but the church maintained a list of books that were banned. And the number one book, believe it or not, the number one book was the Bible. Now you say that's crazy. The whole base of Christianity is the Bible, but the reality is, fast forward to, I urge everyone to read a book by Barbara Tuchman, one of my 3 or 4 favorite history books, and I got a lot of history books. It's called The Distant Mirror, about the 14th century, which is the great transition from medieval Europe to the Renaissance, when everything was going crazy. You had a pope in Avignon in France, you had a pope in Rome, you had the Black Death. It was like a perfect storm of insanity. But if you read about how decadent the papacy was, anyone reading the Bible and seeing how the church behaved would see the disconnect was so extreme.
Right.
That's one of the stories in Boccaccio's Decameron. That's a great story
Mm.
about a Jew who converts to Christianity because it's a fantastic, because he sees that Christianity is so successful despite the insanity and the corruption of the popes that it's got to be right. It was like Boccaccio's way of totally ripping into, in a satirical way, very risque for that time, into what was going on in the church at the time. So you have a veneer of Christianity. They have a Christian world. You have this veneer of spirituality. Most people are on subsistence level. But what starts to come out of that is then, and this is the way we learned history, going back to 1,000 years ago when we were in school. We learned that what happened after this Dark Ages, then you have the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? The Renaissance was the rediscovery of the classical, more humanistic. More humanistic means more, this world. The church was all about it. When you think about it, you want to control people politically. In the modern world today, you create a totalitarian regime that lives in a perceived state of constant conflict with an outside enemy, because all totalitarian regimes can only stay in power and explain the lack of rights and the lack of physical comforts. We're at war. There's an enemy. It's those
Right. You
guys.
you unite the people and silence them through fear and like, oh, if we don't stick together and do things our way, we'll all die.
Right. So, but how do they do it? How do they do it in medieval Europe? It's like there's the devil. He's after your soul. And if and this this world really sucks for everyone. Medieval Europe really stunk for most people. But you know what? The next world is really good. So, as Paul said, the apostle, Paul, the most influential person in Christian thinking, Saul Paul, he said, don't rebel against authority. So the church is playing up on its authoritarian power to keep people in line with promises of salvation and threats of damnation.
Right.
So this keeps the world in line. So when you get to the rediscovery of the more classical humanistic view of the Renaissance, then it's kind of like all that wisdom that had been suppressed and lost because Europe went backwards intellectually. The Islamic world was going forward at the time. Now after that they went backward. But the Islamic world was the ones who were rediscovering, and Jews were involved in translating from the Arab world, sending the works from Arabic to Hebrew to Europe, where Jewish scholars in Europe would read it in Hebrew and translate it into Latin and give it back to the church. So Jews played a huge role in repollinating this thought back. But this is the beginning of a process of weaning of the with the church splitting, by the way, and not being monopolistically controlling of what's going on. It's their power is somewhat weakened, and it's weaning the world off of this hyper focus on its just God and hellfire and damnation and salvation, and bringing in intellectual ideas. And we all know what happened with that, with Galileo and challenging church dogma regarding the earth being the center of the world and being dragged before like a commission of like inquiry to like for heresy and stuff like that. So there's definitely pushback against it. But like we know in Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, ideas kind of come into the world and they're not stoppable. And from the way we learned it is, okay, so thank God that backward religious oppression of the medieval period starts to be weakened by the Renaissance, and from 1350, and then we get to 1650, then we have the Enlightenment. And what's the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment is when it's called, what's the other term used to describe the Enlightenment? The Age of Reason.
Right.
And now,
Right. Like
backward,
now science comes
superstitious.
in, everything else, everything other than science is nonsense, backwater, old thinking that isn't true.
Right, right. So we can push aside that anti-intellectual, fanatical, dogmatic theology, which is not open to obvious scientific truths like the Earth revolving around the sun and yada yada yada. And this was not happen overnight. There was push and pull and heresy and accusations, and change happened slowly, but it's very very dramatic. And then what do we learn from that? The next phase is, of course, with 1650, with the Enlightenment, and you get to the Age of Reason, and then you get to the Industrial Revolution. And because Europe, which is where this all begins, and America is an offshoot, America is an outlier community, it becomes a superpower. That's how it works in this world. What is the end of the earth where no one's living hundreds of years later will be the center of everything. But America is basically a European colonization project. Then we get to religion is pushed aside, logic, rational thought, the human and his brain is at the center of everything, the rules of science, principles that transcend, scientific principles and philosophical principles, and the classical philosophy. The Greeks were obsessed with this, like these ideas that are perfect ideas that exist out there. Go read Plato, perfection of forms and things like that. Now we create a modern world which is weaned from religion, which allows the creation of liberal secular democracy, which it's that enabled the world to finally become free and prosperous and open. And it's religion is boom, sidelined, and now we're open to everything and freedom, and now it's freedom is everything. And the reality, Ellie, is that is a gross oversimplification of what actually happened. And that's the interesting thing no one seems to know about. Shockingly so.
And
Shockingly
I
so.
think what's important about this is that it really shapes our dialogue today, which is, especially in the Western world, the world believed in God and then they woke up and found science and found this, and now they got real, and now everybody's living in reality, and anything to do with God or religion is archaic and doesn't apply, and the spiritual life is just woo woo nonsense.
Exactly. Exactly. Which is completely not true. And it also, going back to what we're talking about, because people are thinking, how do we get to this from talking about, the hostages in Gaza? Because this is peeling off a few more layers of the onion to see that the reality is this precisely of what I would like to explain now about really happened. Then we understand what is the true connection between Israel, the modern state of Israel, and what it's founded on, which is Jewish people and Judaism, and the United States, and also Europe and Western civilization. Because what really happened is actually very different from that. Because one of the things we leave out is, with the printing press, which in the 15th century, movable type is invented in Europe. Okay, you could say maybe Asia had it before, but in Europe, the ability, books before that were copied by hand, basically by monks. They always say that the irony of Europe was the only real literate people in Europe were monks, and they didn't bother to at least legally reproduce. So
Right.
the smartest, best educated people had no offspring. So it kind of kept the dumb dumber. So, but the reality is with movable type, you now have the ability to mass produce books very cheaply. And but the other thing that comes along, it's another with early 16th century Martin Luther, Protestantism. When he 1517, when he nails his 95 theses on the door of the his complaints against the Catholic Church. And the Protestants, what they brought into the world, that's a huge topic, is this whole notion of this much to human beings should is much more closer to Judaism, by the way. You should have a direct relationship with God. Why do you need sacraments in a church and the Pope? That's an obvious reason if you're in power, because if you can go directly to God, why do you need sacraments, church, and the Pope? They're
Right.
irrelevant. This is very threatening. So all that stuff is out the window, and boy, is there pushback against this. And this is something, it's not just Martin Luther and it's not just, Wittenberg's printing press. Everyone should read about Wycliffe and Tyndale in England at this time. These were British Christians who were, certain of them lost their lives trying to get the Bible printed, like getting the Bible
Mm.
out there, because what the Protestant, in a nutshell, I'm grossly oversimplifying this topic, but the big Protestant thing was you should learn to read so you can read his book and think for yourself and take responsibility and make decisions. By the way, that's something that Jordan Peterson would agree with, and that's something that God would definitely agree with.
Right.
Take responsibility for yourself. But that leads to an explosion of the proliferation of what is the biggest selling book of all time, which is the Hebrew Bible, which, by the way, until today in America, it sells 2,000 copies an hour in the United
Wow.
States. The
Wow.
Bible, 2,000 copies an hour in the Bible. That is the greatest transformation. They talk at the Book of Books. Unbelievable, the impact of that. And again, it's not immediate, but we see with the Protestant Reformation and the printing press, and then the British, they had to copy the King James translation of the Bible into the vernacular. Now it's, if you could mass print the book in Latin, I give you a copy of the Bible in Latin. You're not going to be able to read it at all. Now we're going to write the book in English. So, and every church in England had a Bible chained in the church that anyone can come read. This is big stuff. This is absolutely transformative.
Right.
But think about what's changing now. You're shaking up central authority. You're getting people to think on their own. And this leads to what's called political Hebraism, which is a fascinating topic. In 2010, a book came out, a guy by the name of Eric Nelson. It's called The Hebrew Republic. And there's been many books that come out since that, but I saw this book and I immediately bought it. That's how my parents used to always know I'm coming to America because all the Amazon books started showing up. And he basically he basically goes over and he says that he basically, in it, says exactly what I've been saying, that people used to think that it's basically, the Age of Enlightenment and the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, weaning Europe and later America off of this closed-minded, fanatic, dogmatic church that enabled the creation of the modern world. But then, and I want to actually read you what he says. He says, it was in the 17th century, the 1600s, in the full fervor of the Reformation, it's the Protestant Reformation, that political theology, interesting term, right?
Mhm.
re-entered the mainstream of European intellectual life. The Protestants' summons to return to the biblical text brought with it incessant appeals to God's constitutional preferences as embodied in Scripture. Meaning, what, simple English, what government, if this is the book given by the creator of the universe, what form of government does God want? During this period, Christians began to regard the Hebrew Bible as a political constitution designed by God Himself for the children of Israel. Whoa. God
Fascinating.
took them out of Egypt and said, here's my government. This is how you run the world. You can't do better than God. They also came to see the full array of newly available rabbinic materials as authoritative guides to the institutions and practices of this perfect republic. Meaning, if we are looking for how to transform the world, and take all this to mind, and now we have access to the Bible, why reinvent the wheel? Let's go back and see, like, what kind of
Okay,
government does
so
God want?
so let me check if I get this straight. So what you're saying is we often have this perception that during the Enlightenment, the world went from religious to secular, and secular being science and da 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 and politic and things like that. But what you're saying is actually religion transformed into a system of democracy and political government as kind of laid out in the Bible. Are you saying
Exactly. That's exactly what
that's
I'm saying. And
crazy?
what the world weaned itself off was the power of the Catholic Church to oppress. What
Right.
it weaned itself onto was, why go for the imitation? Let's go to the original source. And when we said, and then you have to understand, this is not just a bunch of saying, let's read the Bible. These are some of the greatest minds of what's called the early modern period, 16th, 17th century. We're talking about people like John Selden. We're talking about people like John Locke, who's the father of what is real liberalism, not what the term used today. We're
Right.
talking about Thomas Hobbes. We're talking about Hugo Grotius, the father of international law. These are some of the greatest transformative minds of the last 500 years, were what's called Hebraists. Hebraists were people who were not that they were hanging out with Jews and going to the online classes, taught by this rabbi. These were people who were saying, we need to understand what God wants. And they also got, and this is the difference between these Hebraists and a lot of the evangelicals of today. A lot of the Christians I deal with are literal scripturalists. The only thing they'll go to is the English translation of the Bible. It says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You poked out mine, I'm poking out yours. Now, that is not how Jewish law works, by the way. The Bible is not a
Right.
law book. It is a book of theology and hashkafa, worldview. Jewish law is learned from the oral law, which is far more complicated and difficult. Jews spend their whole life learning. That's what the Talmud is. That's what the Mishnah is. These scholars recognize, this is before Art Scroll and the English translations. These scholars recognize that if you want to understand God's constitutional preferences, you can't just read the Bible. You have to go to the sources. And they literally either learned Hebrew or translated from the Hebrew some of the great works like the Mishnah. They love the Rambam, Maimonides,
Wow.
who died in 1205. He's the great codifier of Jewish law. The Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, the great commentators, because there you get, when you look at Maimonides, he goes through the whole breakdown of biblical government, of separation of powers, of kingship and a high priest and a judicial legislative body. This stuff is unbelievable. He said, this is the kind of government that we want. So
Wow.
this is what's going on. But then think of what's going on at the same time as all this is happening. This is the founding of America, because you have all these religious conflicts going on with Huguenots and these different groups of breakaway groups from the church in France that were like Protestant breakaway groups, and the siege of La Rochelle. Go read the Three
Right.
Musketeers. It's all in there. And a lot of them are fleeing to America in search of religious freedom. By the way, the Pilgrims who arrived in 1620, go see Plymouth Rock. And Plymouth, it's a rock. It says 1620 carved into it. It's in a cage now. Um, they view their journey as reenacting the Exodus from Egypt. The Atlantic Ocean is the sea splitting. We're crossing like Moses and the ancient Hebrews. And Plymouth Rock is our Mount Sinai. We're making a new covenant in a new pure piece of real estate where we'll have the spiritual, not the papist Catholic stuff that's polluted and evil. We're going to have this new pure, like the promised land is America. I mean, you have no idea how much they bought into this stuff. And by the way, how much the early colonists were totally into um, using biblical Hebrew Bible, not the Christian Bible, as the scriptural foundations for their legal codes in places like New Haven. Listen to, by the way, this is for a second. This is great. This is Samuel Langdon, president of Harvard Congress of Massachusetts Bay, 1775. He says, now, before I read, listen to this. This is John Davenport, First Assembly of New Haven, Connecticut Colonists, 1639. This is amazing. This is a Christian who arrives in America. Scripture, meaning the Bible, do hold forth a perfect rule for the direction and government of all men in all duties which they are to perform to God and men, as well as in the government of families and commonwealth, as in the matters of the church. Meaning the Bible is holistically the only guidebook we need for both spiritual life, family life, and legal life in our colony. And he goes on to say, the word of God shall be the only rule to be attended onto in organizing the affairs of government in this plantation. Meaning, we're going to the Hebrew Bible. They all named their kids. They didn't call them Matthew and Luke. They're all named Jeremiah and Obadiah and Abraham and Sarah. That's the pure stuff. And we're going to go back. They were, by the way, literal scripturalists. But I'm saying that, so they're not so much into, but I'm talking about these great philosophical thinkers. They're like, what government does God want? And there's a very clear form of government laid out in the Bible, which is a monarchy with a judiciary, a separate judiciary legislative body, and a priesthood, which is not the king. The king and the priest, the high priest, like the king of England is the head of the Anglican Church. This is
Right,
huge stuff.
meaning a clear separation between church and state, a clear understanding of a body of, like, like it's described, judges, that you have, one judge for 10 people, another judge for 100 people, another judge for 1,000. Like, you have a whole sort of system laid out. Yeah, it's super interesting. I think so often in the West, we make the assumption that Western democracy or liberal democracy was created in the absolute absence of anything to do with religion.
Exactly. And that's exactly what's not true. That's so not true. By the way, separation of church and state is not what it's perverted into people saying now. The founding fathers of America would be horrified at the notion of no God in the United States. I said no country is more God-based in its foundations than America is. No question about it. But the idea of church and state is freedom of conscience, and
Mm,
that there's no state religion. Yeah, but that the whole, American, the idea, by the way, they offered George Washington to be king initially. He said, we already got one of King George. We're not going to have me as a king. But
right.
but when the American Revolution breaks out, they used the Bible as scriptural basis to rebel against King George of England. They take the story of Samuel when Samuel anoints, when the Jewish people, after 440 years of having no strong central authority, a loose confederation of states, similar to America was in its beginning, with a court system in the middle, but no king at the time, and you had a prophet, you had a prophet judge, but there was no like supreme political leader. They
Right.
offer they ask for a king from Samuel, who's been the judge for all these years, and he gets upset. What, I'm not good enough to lead you? And God says to Samuel, don't get upset. They haven't rejected you, they've rejected me.
Mm.
So Thomas Paine from New Rochelle, where I grew up, like who was the great intellect of the uh, of the American Revolution, he used that exactly to talk about, to show exactly that God doesn't like kingship. He's like totally not into it. Look at how much God
Huh.
is angry for us asking for a king, and they use that in the American Revolution. See, get rid of the King of England. We have scriptural support for that idea, but it was the idea of literally basing, and this is the part that's really interesting. In America, the U.S. government, the model for the U.S. government is the biblical model of Israel. They
Mm.
just replaced the chief political leader, however, is not a king; he's a president. And you have and what would be the Congress, the Senate, and the Supreme Court are rolled up into one body, which is called the Sanhedrin, which is the High Court, Supreme Court. But then there's, as you said exactly, there's a lower court system. But also ingrained in this is a whole massive series of laws about personal freedoms and responsibilities, which are the cornerstone of the Jewish view of reality. That it's a government of the people and by the people and for the people is a very, very Jewish idea. So, aha. So now we begin to understand what's really going on here. So we understand this political evolution of Europe away from, okay, the veneer of religion is the church, into this openness and the reintroduction of the Bible into and the not just into theology and morality, but into political thought. And then boom, perfect storm. Now we can take a clean slate called America and found a country that is based more on the Bible than anything else. Right on the Liberty Bell, it says, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. All of the emblems of the original universities in America I even have the picture. I even have a picture of them over here. It's not going to come out so well because of this, but I have. They're all. It's unbelievable. Like you see, you have a Harvard, in Yale University. It says Orium Vitumim in their emblem, which is Orium Vitumim is the breastplate of the high priest. The in
Fascinating.
Dartmouth, Columbia University, in the emblem of Columbia till today, it has the four-letter name of God, the Yud K Vav K name. It's in Dartmouth College. It has all Kael Shakai, all powerful God in their emblem. These schools were all founded to educate people and also to train people to be missionaries, to missionize the Native Americans. The
Right.
first suggested seal for the Great Seal for America. Now we have the eagle with the E pluribus unum holding the arrows. The first Great Seal of the United Nations was 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 a was proposed by Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin. Was a picture of the sea splitting with the Jew standing on the shore and Pharaoh drowning, and it said, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God."
Wow.
So this, so we've been brainwashed into not understanding our history and understanding how unbelievably transformative. And obviously, with America leading the way, Europe has since emerged much more recently. By the way, a lot of European countries were monarchies or totalitarian states. But the explosion of democracy with America as the model for a peaceful transition into a political system that allows for true economic and political freedom comes from the United States as that most successful story in the late 18th century. And the rocket fuel for that is the Hebrew Bible and the great thinkers who were influenced by it earlier. So now we understand when the Iranians are screaming, America truly is the basis, and you get people saying this, like Lindsey Graham when he's talking in Congress, the well-educated Christian senators and congressmen in America, they get this point that when they talk about America is the symbol and Israel's the source, it is not just figurative; it is literal.
Mm.
It is literal, and what is at stake now is, and America has become. Think about it, America is the superpower country that is supporting the survival of liberal democracy in the world when it's been threatened throughout history, whether it's in the time of World War II or whether it's through communism. And now, whether it's through radical Islam that is united with the most insane, internal, almost cancerous disease that it's infested with, which is people who are raised in all this freedom and prosperity, who are literally drilling holes in their own ship to sink themselves with the 1619 project that America's founded on the original sin. And are you kidding me? So it's created this crazy alliance of radical Islam with these spoiled children of liberal, progressive, democratic countries who have lost a complete understanding of where they come from and why they have what they have. But that's the
Got
great
it.
threat
Meaning,
today.
meaning that a lot of the liberals on the left have forgotten that the reason there is a left in the first place is because of Judeo-Christian values that were brought and used as the foundation to create a liberal democracy. So it's hard to have one without the other, but this perception that liberal democracy or Western democracy is the same thing as secularism is not necessarily it's not an accurate read of history, and it's also not understanding like the cut flower. Like if you chop yourself off from the roots of your ideology, eventually you're not connected to that at all, and can you survive without it? And I think what you're saying is that they've lost the plot, so to speak. Like you need a certain connection to the reasons why a liberal democracy exists in the first place, which is rooted in interestingly enough, the Hebrew Bible, which is
Yeah.
wild.
But you said exactly the cut flower ethic. Will Herberg, the mid 20th century Jewish thinker, who talked about how all these progressive liberal values initially all come equality before the law and education, all these things come out of the Jewish worldview and out from the Bible. But what now has happened in the world is what we were mistaught happened earlier. Now Western liberal society in Europe, more than America, has cut itself off from its spirituality and its roots and the Bible. So now they pay lip service to these nice words like equality, but now it's become equity, diversity, that stuff, and it's lost its biblical roots. So you have a bunch of people who are just mouthing platitudes that have no real solid spiritual, ethical basis for what they believe. They're being pulled into this woke, crazy ideology, which is antithetical in so many ways to the values that allowed it the political systems that gave birth to it, which is Western liberal democracy, combining with, which is another interesting little tweak just to touch before we finish up here. Okay, so what's with the Muslims and Arab and radical Islam? Those guys, those Iranians. Okay, I understand. Like totally secular people whose religion is secular, progressive, woke ideology is their faith now, and they've replaced traditional religious Bible-based faith with this new faith. But these Muslim guys, and these Iranian, Revolutionary Guard guys, they're really into God. But again, it's not. It's a superficially. It seems like a good question, but it goes back to the exact same point. What does Christianity have, even though they suppressed it for maybe 1,000 years, that Islam never had? Islam has a very pure conception of one invisible God, which is very close to Judaism. But what they never had is the Bible. And when
Mm,
we see, and this is really the point, when you take the idea of one God without the spiritual values based system of the Bible, it just goes in the wrong direction, which is why you get such horrible stuff coming out of people who say they're doing it in God's name. And as
mhm,
Jonathan Sachs said in his book, not in God's name. And when you have people who have really what they think are really nice values that are so nice and touchy feely and sharing is caring and everything, but they're also cut away from God. And how they cut away from God because they've lost their connection to the Bible. It's like a different variation on the same theme. You have two like warped, like bad versions of something that could be really, really nice, which is the real nice liberal democratic ideas of true liberalism that comes out of the Bible, and a spirituality based on God that is based on biblical roots and morality and thought and law. And now you have like the warped antithetical versions that kind of feel on a superficial level to be connected, but are totally different and antithetical
mm.
to it. And it's precisely the things that are most different are threatened by the opposite the most. So it doesn't shock me that the radical progressive woke left is so hardcore against Israel, even though a lot of them aren't even aware what we're really talking about, and traditional American values, and they want to tear the U.S. down. You don't see them at these rallies from the river with American flags. They're burning American flags and Israeli flags. And it doesn't shock me that these Muslims who are saying Allahu Akbar, God is great, and Inshallah, God willing, and Alhamdulillah, and God be praised, are also coming after because they're not. And I'm not saying all Muslims are being this way. That's not the
Right.
issue there. Islam has a lot. Judaism would say Islam is much closer to the truth and
Mhm.
reality than any pagan belief system of the ancient world. But what they've done with it and hijacked it and turned it in the wrong direction, like what's been done with what was this beautiful idea of liberal democracy that's gone in the wrong direction, is toxic. And it's going after what it feels is most threatening to it as a political economic threat. It's the United States. And as a spiritual ideological threat, it's the Jewish people and the Jewish state of Israel.
It's so fascinating, and I think it really flips the modern narrative on its head, which is, again, West is secular, East is religious. I think the idea that Western democracy is actually a political theology, when really, if we think about Iran, for instance, like that's a political theology, meaning their theology and their politics are absolutely embedded with each other. And you can't actually separate them out. That's what a caliphate is. But if you put that beside Western democracy, we think, oh, well, this is just a secular system that's based in, good values and principles. But actually, no, it's deeply embedded, just not saying you have to believe in God in order to practice being a good person. So it actually has that democratic piece, which is you can be in this democracy under one God, but you have the freedom to make your own choices. And I think that's really also what we're seeing in these places where there's a political theology in the negative, which is if you don't adhere to believing and practicing in what we believe in and practice, we'll throw you in jail and kill you. So I think that's so fascinating. It really flips so much of the script on its head, and it makes sense that that kind of horseshoe theory that we're seeing, where suddenly, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So now we see, the um, white supremacists, liberal leftists, and Islamic radicals suddenly lining up into the same pot of stew.
Exactly. And you have all these totalitarian regimes, where there's North Korea, because North Korea has nothing in common with, Iran, and nothing in
Right.
common with Russia, and nothing in common with Venezuelan, but it's all these ideologies that are threatened by what liberal democracy represents, that, because it represents freedoms. Totalitarian regimes hate freedoms.
Right.
It
I was going to
represents
say freedom
opportunity
of
and
thought,
prosperity.
freedom of practice, freedom to protest, freedom to overthrow, a government, freedom, those are all the things that any totalitarian state is going to be nervous about. So that's fascinating.
Exactly. And the sad part is, like I said, that the West, which has attained all of its prosperity and its freedom and its opportunity and everything because of this incredible transformative historical, ideological, religious process, is now left it behind and is turning around and going back. It's like biting itself in the tail. It's going back to the source and lining up. A lot of these Western liberal countries are coming after Israel and realizing everything they have comes from the Jewish people. And I just want to end by reading one very short little quote here. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who died in his fourth term in office when he was president during World War II. And this is one of his fireside chats. And it's such a great quote. He's speaking to the American people, but I always read this to Jewish audiences too. And he's speaking to the world today, but this is an amazing quote. He says, "We cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. Where we have been truest and most consistent in obeying its precepts, we have attained the greatest measure of contentment and prosperity." Beautifully said. Can't say it better than that. To the
Yeah.
extent that we manage to, with God as the source of those values, keep those values in our lives, whether it's we as individual Jews, the Jewish people, the Jewish state, and the world at large. This is the system given by the infinite being. We don't have to change anything of it. But this is the one system, the one hope for humanity. This is the Jewish messianic view. Not that we dominate the world, not that we control the world, but we are the model. The world lines up behind us, and we teach them how to take these beautiful transformative ideas and turn them into reality that's practical for all of humanity today.
I mean, I'll say for me, just to kind of end, it does change for me somewhat my concerns about the protests that are happening in Israel, because in this framework, it actually shows that when Israelis are protesting, they're doing the very thing that scares the pants off of Iran. Like they're actually doing the very thing that really freaks out a totalitarian government, which is the masses expressing their concern with something politically, and that they will, voice that, and that they are safe to voice that. And I think that's really interesting to me, because it feels so scary that these protests are going on in the middle of a war, and while there's so much at stake, and that the world looks and goes, oh, look, Israel, even Israel says it's Israel's fault, like all that craziness around the protests. But in a way, in this light, it's like, no, actually, when there's protests in Israel, that makes um totalitarian governments even more nervous. So I think that that's kind of, it's not perfect, but it flips the script a little bit for me also in that way.
Very true. Very true. Which is why they're happy to use that which they view as a weakness, which is our greatest strength, against us to try with that. That's why the unity is so important.
Right.
Because bottom
Yeah.
line is, all these things are ultimately true. Anything that God puts in the world is time tested, true, eternally so. And the other political systems, which are based on lies, falsehoods, they never survive. And they can terrorize their populations in the world for a certain period of time. But like anything that's not right, you don't recognize gravity, it ends bad for you. You don't recognize the
Right.
realities of the world morally and spiritually, it ends bad for you too. So let's hope that the whole world can get that clarity. That's what I hope.
Awesome. This is such a great zoom out, and I think it gives so much perspective that we aren't able to always hold right now, with the intensity of what's going on. So thank you so much, as always, Rabbi Conspiro. I
You.
want to thank everybody for listening, or whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast. Please check us out on YouTube if you haven't. If you have ideas for topics, or you have comments for us, please email us, please get in touch. All of the information is in the liner notes. I want to just mention that Rabbi Conspiro is also going to be teaching a course, an online weekly Jewish history course, where you'll get an opportunity to learn a lot of the things that we've talked about and more, and also get an opportunity to do a Q&A. So if you want to find out more about that, that is also in the liner notes. And that starts at I think we said the end of October. So after the holidays, we would love to have you guys there. I think that's it for today. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.